What does President Cyril Ramaphosa's January 8th address tell us about the state of the ANC? And what does it say about the 2021 political landscape? For this and more, I'm joined by politics analyst Lukhona Mnguni and independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Gentlemen, good evening, and thank you very much to both of you for joining us. 109 years old is this party. Is the legacy still intact? Khaya, I'll start with you.
Well, I suppose there is always going to be the ongoing conundrum about whether the ANC needs to officially detach itself from the premise of a liberation movement, because we know that as far as we're concerned, and as far as the ANC is concerned, the type of liberation that they had in mind when they were formulated in January 1912 has probably been largely delivered. And I think what they are now struggling with is really the transition from being a liberation movement to a governing party and a governing instrument. And I think the distinction between the two is that anyone who wins an election becomes a governing party, but what we're seeing that the ANC is struggling with understanding how these instruments of governance ought to be deployed at various levels within and around the state. And that is probably what is becoming their biggest gripe at this stage. So it means that their legacy, being a living movement, is an ongoing one. And unfortunately, we tend to have a much better remembrance of the things that happen now than the things that happened 109 years ago.
President Cyril Ramaphosa similarly saying, Lukhona, 27 years of democracy, the ANC cannot campaign on a platform that simply recounts the glories of the past. Has the penny finally dropped?
Well, Thabo, the truth is that football is as good as last. For some strange reason, the ANC wants, but society is quite a vision that forward looking.
Lukhona, I'm gonna try and get you back on a better line because I can't hear what you're saying there. But Khaya, let me talk to you then. 27 years on, the president saying, well, we can't continue to shine on past glories. Has the penny finally dropped? Are they seeing the light?
I think it is eventually leading to an understanding that, unfortunately, as the time goes on and the new voters' roll emerges and people who are perhaps far less enamored with the pre-democracy movement than obviously the people that are voting now, it means that a lot more people that are part of the electoral system are going to be the type of people that actually think we need to actually respond to the issues of the day. They look at what's happening around them within their communities and within their provinces and societies, and then they say, we actually think things could be better. So it's becoming very important for the ANC to repurpose itself and to be more responsive to the issues that people are reflecting on today, rather than it harping back on its glorious history. Because I think no one's going to deny the ANC that its history is indeed quite glorious. But when people do vote and when people go to the ballot, whether it's August or whenever it happens this year, then we go to the local government elections, the issues that are really going to matter to them most are what is happening within their own environments, what it is that their ward councillor, for example, or their community leaders are doing to deliver on the service delivery mandate that the ANC has signed up for in its capacity as a governing party at the national level, and also how it obviously translates to its governance at local level.
Now, he's made some commitments, and one would even say he has put his head on the block here. He says the ANC will not back down on its decision that leaders accused of corruption should step aside from their position. Of course, saying the NEC will revisit the matter of the Integrity Commission, saying those leaders should step aside. What are the implications of this for him, considering that one of those leaders is the SG of the ANC, Ace Magashule?
Look, I think we obviously cannot run away from the fact that one of the ANC's top 6 elected leaders is directly affected by how that resolution goes. But I think what the ANC's view was at the point in time where they came up with this idea was that in far too many of the national political discourse matters, the ANC is found wanting. It is found on the wrong side of every conversation around corruption. Cyril Ramaphosa himself is the one that referred to the ANC as accused number 1. So I think the ANC took a position that it was in its collective best interest in order for it to sort of find a way to distance itself from people who are tainted in one form or another. The problem, of course, is that it was always going to be a good idea theoretically until you have to apply apply it in reality. And when you do have to apply it in reality, suddenly everybody's got a particular defense, one or another, to say, well, even though we may have taken that resolution, it doesn't apply to me because of this and that. And I think the ANC's ongoing struggle is to firstly take the position of whether they're going to be very clear and explicit into what those rules and those guidelines are going to be, and then implement them consistently and fairly across the board. Because failure to do that will simply mean that everybody's going to claim that they're part of a political conspiracy that is orchestrated at the highest levels of the party.
All right, Lukhona, let's try again. ANC president saying leaders who fail to give an acceptable explanation as to the charges that they're facing will be summarily suspended. I mean, a simple question there will be, will the ANC be able to suspend Ace Magashule?
Well, Thabo, I think the most basic question is probably what constitutes an acceptable explanation. And we are none the wiser. I have not heard anybody from the NEC being able to articulate exactly what that means, because you need to have a rubric on how do you achieve an acceptable explanation, and who determines that it is an acceptable explanation. Given that the Integrity Commission serves almost at the luxury of the NEC, because whatever the Integrity Commission decides, it cannot be implemented without the NEC accepting it, which then gives rise to a possibility of the NEC actually overturning decisions of the Integrity Commission. Now, that is a very important issue, because the Integrity Commission will make determination on the basis of what is ethical and what is good in terms of the public standing of the ANC, but the NEC might be swayed to make decisions based on politics and the realities within the ANC. The ANC is still a political organization, unfortunately, and I do not see it making decisions simply out of questions of integrity, because if that were the case, I think the matter, for example, around Dr. David Masondo would have been concluded. The Integrity Commission was quite clear that he must step aside or step down from his deputy minister position as deputy minister of finance. And then, for some strange reason, he orchestrated an appeal, but there's no appeal structure to the Integrity Commission. So in actual fact, that structure on its own remains problematic, and it would be very curious for the NEC to act on Ace Magashule and not on Dr. David Masondo, which I would read as simply political expediency and cowering to public pressure more than anything.
Yeah. Yet the president says the NEC will be finalizing guidelines. Is that merely kicking for touch?
Well, no, it's not kicking for touch. I mean, in one way, it's not kicking for touch if you are trying to create confusion out of the NASREC resolutions. NASREC resolutions are quite clear. Either you step aside, or you face being summarily suspended, temporarily suspended, if you do not give this acceptable explanation, which I think on its own, that phrase creates problems for the ANC. So then for the NEC to make sure, as Khaya was saying, that the guidelines are fair and just, equitable to everybody, so there has to be concrete guidelines that are decided upon by the highest decision-making body in between conferences, which is the NEC. That is fine. It's not necessarily kicking for touch. But what is at issue here is whether or not the Integrity Commission is actually a structure in the disciplinary architecture of the ANC that will stand the test of time, or the ANC's politics are going to take over. Because, Thabo, what we saw towards the end of last year was actually quite remarkable. In KZN, the ANC's Integrity Commission was actually saying that Zandile Gumede does not have to step aside anymore. She must resume her duties in the provincial legislature. Whereas in the national body of the Integrity Commission, it was a different song on Ace Magashule, that he must step aside, and failure to do so, the NEC must invoke a part of its disciplinary sections in the Constitution and temporarily suspend the SG. So you get there's no seamless flow of stance within the ANC. Right. And I think the regulations themselves must actually harmonize how this Integrity Commission functions versus the political bodies that tend to put pressure as well on the Integrity Commission.
Well, we continue next with Lukhona Mnguni and Khaya Sithole, president of the ANC, saying the ANC government and broader society must continue discussions on the viability of a basic income grant. Is this feasible? We'll talk to that next. Back with you now on the news feed late night with political analyst Lukhona Mnguni and independent analyst Khaya Sithole. And we're talking, of course, some of the bets given by President Cyril Ramaphosa, or you should say commitments given by President Cyril Ramaphosa as priorities in his January 8th statement. Khaya, the question of the basic income grant. I mean, this has been with the ANC for many, many years. Why should we believe they're going to do things differently this year? What does the ANC think of the basic income grant? What does government think of the basic income grant? And what is the broader society saying about it?
I think the ongoing issue with the basic income grant is that we always have to be very skeptical around engaging on this question when the ANC does it, because no one can be unaware that this year it is indeed an election year. The local government elections are coming through, and the ANC would have identified the idea or the question of the basic income grant as something that is fundamental to the plight and the fortunes of so many people, particularly when we've seen over the past 9 months, and also that's going to happen over the next year, a lot of people that do not generally qualify for the existing social assistance systems and the social assistance grants that are going to be losing their jobs and are going to be in need of assistance. So of course, the idea of a basic income grant is going to resonate with the electorate. The problem we have with the ANC is that we always have to be very, very circumspect in dealing with the questions of how they tackle matters of this nature, because the very first question that one would ask is why now, why this year? And the reason we have to ask why now and why this year is that everybody knows that it comes with fiscal and financial, complications and financial demands. And the ANC itself, in its capacity as a ruling party, has been telling us that since the lockdown and the pandemic effects on the economy, there's obviously been a loss of revenue. They are currently fighting the unions and arguing that they shouldn't have to be forced to comply with the wage agreement that they signed because there's no money. So you'll be thinking that, hold on, in every other sphere, you as government are telling us that money doesn't exist. And yet here you are trying to talk us into embracing yet again the two most expensive projects that the government could ever undertake, which is the basic income grant and national health insurance scheme. And of course, we can have a conversation around the merits of those things, but for me, it being in an election year means that I'm always going to approach it from a position of great skepticism.
COVID-19 emergency financial measures coming to an end. I mean, if you ask SAFTU, they'll tell you that they're already not paying those. For example, the TERS amount is no longer coming forward because they will tell us they have limited resources and therefore it's no longer feasible to do that. Yet the president says poverty alleviation measures need to come up, and the basic income grant, Lukhona, is what's being touted. Where is this money going to come from? They're going to tax more those who are already earning?
Well, I think, Thabo, the discussion on the basic income grant also comes from a point of weakness from the ANC. They've been pressured a lot by activists and civil society organizations, particularly during the times of lockdown. And the reason is simple. There are a lot of people in South Africa who are in precarious employment, and by that, people who are extremely vulnerable. If something happens today, for example, people in the informal economy, something happens today and there is a lockdown, they are without work tomorrow. But not only is that, they are without income. People who almost live on the day-to-day in terms of the work that they do, and they rely on those daily incomes. They have no savings. If they don't work, within a week, the household actually faces issues of threats to hunger and so on. Now, that's where partly the basic income grant comes in. Of course, some people are calling for a universal income grant, which would cover a whole lot more people rather than a conditional basic income grant that is contingent, perhaps on people's income or lack thereof, or people's lack of employment. So I think the discussion is noble, but there is no money. South Africa is broke. And I think as South Africans, this is something we need to accept and start to have conversations on that factual basis. We don't have money. We are running a high deficit on our budget. We have a huge gross debt to gross GDP ratio that is unsustainable. We are spending too much money servicing debt. So when you are asking where is the money going to come from for the basic income grant, my stand is that it's going to come from nowhere. We don't have the fiscal space for that until such time that we restart the economy and make sure that it is working and that we are making more revenue and we are then able to fund all these social goods. Instead, we are now at a situation where we are reprioritizing the budget. We are reprioritizing the budget to afford vaccines. We are reprioritizing the budget to make sure that we try and do fiscal consolidation, but it is not coming. So the point here, Thabo, is that I think the conversation, as the president said, is just to check the desirability and viability. And I think they are going to get stuck on the viability. It's not going to be viable. And Treasury is quite adamant that even the COVID-19 grant, the 350 rands that is being given out to people who are not at work, might come to a stop soon. We will have to start seeing there whether the Treasury will stop those grants. If the 350 rands grants stop, I don't foresee the basic income grant becoming a reality at all, at least nowhere in the immediate term.
You have over 3 million the poorest paid South Africans out of jobs at this particular point, which brings us to that question of whether the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic for President Cyril Ramaphosa will be a make or break moment.
Well, I was quite clear in one article I did last year that in actual fact, how he manages the COVID-19 pandemic will determine entirely his legacy as president of this country. Well, in one instance, it's because I may even be skeptical if he will receive a second term from his own organization. And if that becomes the case, he will leave probably much weaker if he leaves in the state that South Africa is. So I think for the president, really, at this current moment, it's not just about whether people are receiving their grants. I mean, if you talk to people and the queues that we've seen outside post offices across the country, whether from photos or from actual evidence, observations that we've done driving by post offices, if you look at questions of PPE, if you look at questions of this second wave and how it's being managed and how people are saying it seems as if we have not really managed to bolster the health system, even though we had said level 5 was for buying us time in order to make sure that the health system is given the necessary capacity to withstand whatever may come down the line. So in actual fact, if we look back in terms of what has been happening in the management of this pandemic, on the critical issues, we have not done well. We have still not given enough assistance and support to people, for example, in the informal economy, while we have done some stuff for people in the formal economy. So there's going to be a lot, I think, in terms of unpacking and what will be the net cost on the political prospects of the president. But I do think that somewhere down the line, his legacy will be determined by how he showed up or failed to show up when it comes to this pandemic.
Khaya, one of your favorite subjects, the NHI. If you look at the financing of the vaccine, or what you'd say the vaccine finance plan, many are saying this will be a true acid test of whether or not NHI is going to work. Because essentially you've got government, private sector, and philanthropists who are going to pretty much put money in a kitty, right? And let's hope that money is going to be used effectively to get the vaccines, as many as possible, for the poor. What's your analysis of how that's going to play out?
I think, when we reflect back on the questions around the NHI, it was probably always going to be the most ambitious project that the government put together, because you really wanted to change the way the private sector and the public sector work independently and also work alongside each other. So it is quite ambitious. And if it does obviously materialize, it would be a great initiative. I still really believe in the form of social solidarity that the NHI strives to achieve. However, what we've seen, unfortunately, is that the way in which the public sector and the private sector interact remain remarkably divergent. And what we're hoping to see now is that with the vaccine being the thing that now needs to be rolled out and acquired, we see a greater sense of collaboration between the two types of stakeholders. Because I think the reality here, Thabo, is that for once, the private sector understands that it cannot be insulated from the public sector question. Because if the private sector says that we're only going to participate in the vaccination process of our own members, those members aren't all related to people who are also members of medical aids. So it may be self-defeating if you're then saying that we're going to vaccine one part of the population and ignore another part altogether, where the interactions mean that people might still be losing their lives after all. So I do think that the type of collaboration that we've seen being mentioned, it hasn't materialized yet. What we've seen being mentioned is probably going to be fundamental to the country's ability to then say, here's a blueprint of when we did work in a healthcare pandemic between the public sector, the social sector, and the private sector, and we saw what were the outcomes. So that might then become the basis for how we must formulate and purpose the NHI program, should it ever be rolled out.
But the truth is that government on its own will not be able to distribute those vaccines. I mean, never mind the fact that we can't distribute textbooks. You've got to get this vaccine to the most remote, the most rural parts of South Africa. The private sector, for example, liquor companies have proven that they're able to have that kind of footprint in terms of distribution.
Look, I tend to disagree with the idea that the public sector cannot roll out the vaccine to every corner of the country, because guess what? About 18 months ago, during the 2019 general election, it appeared that the state seems to know exactly where every person is based and how to get them to be at a particular spot and to get them to sign on a ballot box on a particular day. So the idea that the state is completely incapable of penetrating and rolling out a project through every single tentacle of the country is actually an ill-conceived one. It's always a question of what matters most to politicians. And of course, the votes that they can come and get from you and I in the hard corners of Matatiele are important to them. Now, the question that we have to deal with is, do they think that the health of the people from those remote areas where they haven't had a clinic for the past 25 to 26 years, where they haven't had resources that enable them to access a primary or even a tertiary healthcare facility within a reasonable amount of time, whether those people matter to the politicians? That is really what the litmus test is here. It's not a question of logistics.
Look, let's wrap it up with you. I mean, the ANC government generally moves at quite a snail pace, but the demands of this economy right now and the state of the nation requires them to move at a quite faster pace than they normally do. Will they be able to manage?
Well, Thabo, the reality is that on the ANC's own admission, they have not been able to actually create what they call a capable state. They continue to make these commitments, but the realization of that commitment is quite at a snail pace. If you look at some of the programs that are being conceptualized by the National School of Government, you get to realize that there is a problem of state capacity. I don't think we will move with the necessary pace. There is a lot of complacency, which is, they call it the sins of incumbency, which creates this complacency in how the state is managed. But I also want to say there is a dearth of visionary leadership as well within the ANC, which then extends itself to government. I don't think we just need doers. We also need a paradigm shift in our visioning for this country, because we are now at a very precarious state where we don't have money, where we do not know what our low-hanging fruits are. So we need to reimagine the state, re-architecture the bureaucracy, and make sure that we actually probably come up with a new South African compact altogether in how to move forward.
Lukhona Mnguni and Khaya Sithole, I appreciate your time, gentlemen, tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night.